Well, it's getting to be the end of the spoiler season for Jump To Lightspeed, the newest set for Star Wars Unlimited, and it's gotten me thinking about what my favorite part is of any spoiler season. And you might be thinking, well, it's probably when they show the cards. No, my favorite part of any spoiler season is when they've already shown all of the cards and people start to make very confident predictions. You see it all the time, whether it's content creators or top players. People will get on camera and they'll make all of these crazy predictions about, oh, this card is going to break the meta or this card is going to be unplayable. And it's always really fun to look back 6 months later and see that people were just as wrong as they were confident. Now, am I a top player? No. Am I a content creator? Unfortunately. Kinda. But either way, I'm going to throw my 2 cents in, even though nobody asked, and I'm going to go through and I'm going to rate all of these cards on a tier list, or 1 to 5 stars, no difference. So D is going to be, this is not going to see play even if you bribe me. I'm not putting this in my deck. It's terrible. Nobody's going to be able to find a use for it in a competitive setting. And S tier is, people are going to want to play this out of aspect. People are going to change the aspect of their deck specifically to play this card. Everybody is going to want this card. It's a meta-defining card. I don't know how many of those there are going to be, but there are some interesting cards. So let's just get started. The first card here is Annihilator, and this is honestly a pretty good one to start on. I'm just going to put it right in A tier because this card is pretty decent in the niche that it belongs to. This is not a universal card where everybody's going to want to play it. It's going to be too slow for a lot of decks. But I do play Bosk Blue, and this is going to be great, especially for control mirrors. So what it does is when it's played and when it's defeated, it destroys an enemy unit, and then you can go through the opposing player's deck and take out any cards with a matching name to this unit. And to be honest, that's fantastic. I mean, if you're playing against a control deck as Bosk Blue or something where Avenger is a really critical card, and this kills all 3 copies, not just one, that's a matchup changing card. At the absolute worst case, you're going to see this in the sideboard, but I expect this to be a main deck card for a variety of control lists. Next up is Darth Vader. I think Darth Vader is a little bit worse. I don't think Darth Vader's a bad card by any means, but I don't think this is necessarily a game changer. I'm going to put it in B for now, with room to put it up to A maybe, depending on how the rest of the tier list looks. The thing that concerns me about Darth Vader is that he isn't necessarily all that great on either side. The thing I like about Darth Vader is that he's pretty good on both sides. So his ground unit version is, he's a 6-cost 7/7, just vanilla unit. Nothing special about him. He doesn't do anything. And then as a pilot, he's a 3/3 for 3 that provides the ability to ping, and then ping again if you kill whatever you're attacking. Both of these are nice. This is not a bad card, but I'm not entirely sure either of these are ahead of the curve enough to be particular game changers. I think this is a card that really is going to see play because of its flexibility. It might see enough play to put it in A tier, but I just don't think it's going to be a game changer for very many decks. It's just going to be an inclusion because it's generally useful. This is not going to be generally useful. This card's going to be terrible. I hate Death Star plans because it's so much of what I don't like about Legendary design. It's theoretically a pretty interesting payoff. This is an upgrade. It's a 0/0, so you're getting no stats. But what it does do is it reduces the cost of it reduces the cost of the first unit you play each phase by 2. The problem here is 2 things. First of all, it reduces cost by 2. It also costs 2, which is not the end of the world, except for the fact that when the unit that is holding this upgrade is attacked, the person who attacked it gets to take it, which means this is an upgrade that's going to be exchanging hands throughout the length of the game. And what very easily could happen in the majority of cases is you're going to play this for 2, you're going to save 2. Now, if you're keeping up with me here, you're not saving anything. And then your opponent is going to swing in, they're going to take this for free, and they're also going to save 2. Personally, that does not sound like a great deal to me. What this reminds me of is if you've ever gone Black Friday shopping and you see these stores that a couple weeks before Black Friday, they mark everything up. And then that way it looks like you're getting a better deal on Black Friday. That's what this is. You're paying 2 extra early so that you can feel better about playing the same 2 less later. You're not actually saving anything, especially because you're not going to be able to hold on to this for a very long time. Thankfully, the next card is a bit better. This, I've seen a lot of people rate extremely highly. I think it's a good card. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a really good card. You can make the argument for it being an S tier card. My concern is that it is going to die pretty easily, and I'm concerned about whether or not indirect damage is going to be particularly great. So if indirect damage is not all that great, this is still a great standalone card. What this is a slightly lower health Star Destroyer that essentially just pings whatever you want for 4 when you play it. That's not a bad deal. It lets you direct where your indirect damage is going, and then it does 4 indirect damage. So you're pinging anything you want for 4. That's great, and it's good enough to offset the relatively low health. The problem here is if indirect damage, generally speaking, is not all that great, which I have mixed feelings about, that's as good as it's going to get. It's going to be another Star Destroyer that you can choose to potentially run, but you're not necessarily going to get a ton of extra value in it unless indirect damage is good enough that decks are running a lot of indirect damage. Now, if indirect damage is great, this is easily an S tier card. If indirect damage is a prominent feature of the meta, being able to direct all of your indirect damage is going to be one of the most broken effects in the game. But I don't really like a lot of the rest of the indirect damage cards. I don't think they're going to be that impressive. And as a result, I'm going to put this in A tier as a card that is going to do quite well, even if you're only running a couple of sources of indirect damage, but isn't really going to get pushed to that next level, because I don't think the mechanic itself is enough of a game changer. I am going to rate this a little higher, though, this Executor, a little higher than I think other people might rate it. So this is an 11 cost 12/12 with Overwhelm. Now that's very expensive and it's very big. What does it do? Well, if we compare it to Annihilator, it's not getting to kill things or take things out of the deck. It's actually doing something much worse. It's creating 3 TIE Fighter tokens when played, on attack, and when defeated. These TIE Fighter tokens are 1/1s. They're pretty useless. They're not that helpful when it comes to providing a really big board presence or really doing anything to win you the game. But what I think makes Executor a decent card is how prevalent sacrifice effects are as a core component of most removal packages, especially cards like Merciless Sacrifice and Power of the Dark Side. Because the second you play Executor, you automatically, when it's played, you get 3 TIE Fighter tokens. And I recently played against a different deck that makes use of a lot of 1/1 tokens. I played against Dooku. And Dooku's not necessarily that great of a deck. It's okay, but it's not that great. But what is really good is when the Dooku player holds a couple extra battle droids in reserve so that you cannot play Avenger, Merciless Sacrifice, Power of the Dark Side. This doesn't die to any of those, and those are big pieces of the meta. Those are cards you see very often. So this is going to be harder to remove. Of course, you can still play targeted removal, but it being immune to a relatively popular form of removal is a point in its favor. I expect to see this pop up sporadically. I don't expect to see this super often, but I do expect to see this occasionally in decks like Double Green Emperor Palpatine. I don't expect to see the Ghost. I really sympathize with people that love the Spectre archetype, but I just don't see it happening, and I don't think the Ghost is really the piece to turn this archetype around. Spectres have some really good cards. You've got Kanan, which sees play. You've got the red Sabine, the Sabine from set 1, that sees play. The unit, obviously the leader, sees play. I don't need to tell you that. Ezra sees some play. Chopper and Zeb don't really, but they easily could if you made a dedicated Spectre deck. But there's just not a ton of reason to. A lot of these cards are equally good outside of the Spectre package. And when you put the whole Spectre package together, you don't really get a lot for it. And this is supposed to be a tie together piece that really helps boost all of the Spectres when you play them together. And so what it does is it gives all of the Spectres its keywords, which could have been great, but when it gets upgraded, the first keyword it gets is Sentinel. And a lot of the Spectres don't want Sentinel. It's understandable if you want Sentinel on Kanan or something, but the one, if not both, possibly both Sabines specifically cannot be targeted unless they have Sentinel. So you very much do not want them to have Sentinel. And a lot of these other cards, yeah, they're good, but they're not really going to make the Ghost a big enough payoff. They don't give the right combination of keywords to make this a huge payoff. I do like I think it's called the Phantom 2 is going to give all of your Spectres grit. That's good, but I just don't expect this to see much of any meaningful play. People are going to try it. You could maybe move it into Siege just because people are going to be stubborn about it, but I just don't expect it to work. I do expect Han Solo to work. The really cool thing about this card, before I actually seriously rate it, the really cool thing about this card is, and really the cool thing about this game, is how wonderful it is to be able to see beloved Star Wars characters on cards that you can play in the meta. You know, big characters like this, it's just so exciting to see Han Solo, a character we've never seen in this game before, finally get a card. I'm just so excited. We've never seen Han Solo. And this one's going to be good. So Han Solo is a 5-cost 4/5 with ambush. It's got piloting, and the piloting allows it to instantly attack with the attached ship if that ship is a Millennium Falcon, another unit we've never seen before. It's not going to take damage for the attack. And the piloting stats are 2/3. So it's good stats across the board. It's got ambush or pseudo ambush. If the attached ship is Millennium Falcon, it's a much better form of ambush. And as we all know, heroic cunning decks are very prevalent, and a lot of them feature Han Solo and Millennium Falcon centric synergies already. So a lot of these decks are running the first Millennium Falcon from set 1, but in case you need reminding, there's also Lando's Millennium Falcon, there's the new Millennium Falcon from this set, and then on top of that, there's a new starter deck coming out with another Millennium Falcon sometime in, I believe, September, the Hoth starter decks, which I believe are going to be Premier legal. It's called Premier, right? I always want to say Standard. Whatever it's called, the Standard format. So the next card is also going to be in the same colors. I do think it's a little bit worse because it's not so easily abused with Millennium Falcon, which is a really, really, really popular card. But I do think it's going to be great, so I'm going to put it in A tier. Home 1 is a 9-cost 7/8 with ambush, and if your opponent has 3 or more space units, it costs 3 less. Which means if your opponent has 3 or more space units, you're playing this for 6 without any ramp, without any further cost reduction. You're playing this for 6. And there are other ways. Of course, the Han Solo deck can get quite a few extra resources. There's that, I don't remember what it's called, Get That Ship or something like that, which further reduces the cost of a ship. So this is going to be a card that you can play for 6 pretty often, I think, because forget about all of the ramp, forget about all the further cost reduction. The big thing that this set is supposed to do is it's supposed to shift more of the gameplay into the space arena. For the entirety of the first year of this game, the Space Arena was, I almost want to say, an afterthought. The Space Arena, most of the gameplay went on in the Ground Arena, and unless you were playing a dedicated aggro space deck designed to take advantage of the fact that most people weren't playing space, you probably weren't going to have 3 space units. But this set, if it does what it is designed to do, is going to change that, and having 3 space units is going to become infinitely more common. And playing this for 6, I think, is quite good. It's hard to overstate the impact of ambush. I think it's probably the best keyword in the game. And it's good stats. So this is an easy A tier card. A Hondo, I'm going to put in C tier. Maybe I should put him in D tier. Probably I should put him in D tier. But I don't actually think this is a bad card. I just think this is a card that doesn't necessarily have an immediately obvious home. And at some point during this card's time in the rotation, I expect that to change. This is a double blue card. It's a 4-cost 3/5 with shield, which is a pretty defensive stat line, but that's a respectable stat line. And it's going to allow you to move around to upgrades. Not only moving its own shield to another unit you control, but also taking upgrades from opposing players' units. And this can be really good. Now, it is important to note they're non-pilot units. You cannot move pilots, otherwise this would be really, really good. But I think this is a good card, and I think as the card pool expands over the next year, this is probably going to look a little bit better. Now, it's still only in C tier because it's double blue, and I'm having a hard time thinking of what deck is going to want to find use for this. But the problem with a card like Death Star Plans is that it is objectively bad even if you play it in the perfect circumstance. It just doesn't do anything that's particularly useful. Hondo is not that bad. I think that if you play this in the perfect circumstance, if you find the right deck for it, it does things you want. I don't know what that is. Maybe like a weird turret double blue deck. I don't know. There's really not much right now. But that can easily change. Personally, I kind of want to try double blue Gar Saxon and run Hondo. I think that could be really interesting. I don't know if it'll go anywhere, but I think this is a little bit better than the other truly bad legendaries. The next card is Invincible. This is going in exactly the same place for very similar reasons. So this is a 6-cost 6/6, and when you deploy a leader, it has a mini waylay effect. The problem with this card isn't that this card is bad. It's pretty respectably costed. It's got decent stats. Waylay effects, little waylay effects like this are pretty useful. But the thing that makes this card pretty good is that if you control a unique separatist, it costs 1 less. The big problem here is that there aren't a lot of unique separatists in the meta. Specifically, the way that you pull this off the most consistently is by having a unique separatist leader, because regardless of whether it's deployed or not, that will count as your unique separatist, and this will permanently cost 5. And when I look at the unique separatists that could be running yellow cards, I'm not seeing a ton of room for this card right now. So again, this is on its own, it's a good card. I'm going to put it in C tier. I expect it to see fringe play. But the cards, or the leaders that I'm excited to run this in, Trench, Grievous, that sort of thing, aren't leaders I expect to make big splashes in the meta, so I think that's going to limit this card's usefulness regardless of the fact that it's relatively decent. The next card, not so decent. I think this Nebula Ignition card is absolutely terrible. So this is anything without an upgrade gets destroyed. It's a board wipe, but it's more of a conditional board wipe. So this is best played in a deck that makes heavy use of upgrades. Maybe some type of double blue deck or a Gar Saxon deck that runs a lot of shields, maybe runs a lot of pilots, runs a lot of just as many upgrades as you can. And the best case scenario for this is all of your stuff is upgraded, all of their stuff isn't. It's a one-sided board wipe, you win the game. But that's a big ask. That requires you to have a lot of upgraded stuff, and that's a big condition, because the better upgrades are, the better this is for you, except for the fact that the better upgrades are, the more likely your opponents are to have upgrades, and if your opponents are also running pilots or anything of the sort, and there are a lot of pilots in this set, this is not going to destroy their stuff. So this essentially reads like destroy some stuff, which is not what you want out of a board wipe, which is typically an emergency button. Oh no, everything is going poorly, let's wipe the board and start over. That's not reliable enough for that usage, so I'm not feeling it. Planetary Bombardment has a lot of the same upsides as Devastator and a lot of the same downsides, so that's a lot of damage. 12 damage if you control a capital ship, 8 if you don't. That's fantastic. For 6, that's pretty good. The problem here is that this sort of requires other cards to be good and in your deck for it to be useful. So the reason that this is getting rated lower than Devastator is because I think Devastator is quite good, even if it's the only indirect damage card in your deck. Planetary Bombardment, for you to really get use out of it, Devastator needs to be out, and you maybe need to be running more of an indirect damage package in general. If you're not, I don't know if this is great. So the difference between this and Devastator is just how often it's going to be useful. I think in a deck that is really all in on indirect damage, which again, I don't know if that'll be good, this will be a good card. I don't know how to rate Profundity. I'm not going to let that be an excuse. I mean, if we're being real, we don't know which of these cards are going to be good for the most part. But this one specifically, I don't know where it's going to go, and I don't play decks in this aspect. I've thought about it a little bit. I must admit, I have not thought about it a ton, but like heroic red decks that want to go late, Han 2, I guess, Windu, but who really plays Windu? Not a lot of people play Windu. It's got a discard effect, so what it does is it discards a card and then discards another if your opponent still has more cards. How many red heroic decks are out there that want to go late game and also want to have a relatively low hand size compared to their opponent? I think it's between B and C for this. I'm going to go B because I don't think the card itself is bad, and I think it's a little more generically useful than like Hondo and Invincible. But I think this is kind of, you're going to be happy to play it if you need a card like this, but a lot of decks are not going to need a card like this. Radiant is another card with potential upside, but I'm just not really feeling it. So this is 7 cost, 5/6. Each enemy non-leader unit gets -1 attack for each damage on it. So it's not great stats for cost, but if it stays out there and your opponent's stuff gets damaged, if your opponent's stuff gets dinged up, pinged, whatever it is, your opponent's stuff is also going to be much worse stats for cost. The problem here is, so when played, deal 5 indirect damage to a player is nice, but again, unless you're running the full, all-in indirect damage package, they're going to be able to eat this to something that doesn't matter, take the damage to their base, whatever, and then take their 7-drop, which is going to be much bigger than yours, swing in, their thing isn't going to die, yours is, and you're not going to get a chance to use the static ability. And the thing that makes this worse than the other indirect damage cards is that so far, a lot of the enthusiasm I've seen for indirect damage is coming from a list that mainly plays around Devastator and tries to get it out using Piet, which obviously is not going to be running yellow cards. So this requires you to play an indirect damage list that's a little different, maybe a Boba list, and I don't necessarily expect that one to be particularly popular or particularly strong. But again, there is a little bit of a who knows sort of aspect whenever you're rating a brand new mechanic. It could be way better than anybody's imagining, but right now I'm not seeing it. I'm also not seeing Scramble Fighters. I think Scramble Fighters is an easy 1-star card. It's got very minimal payoff. So this is a 7 cost. You get 8 TIE Fighters. You get to ready them, but then they can't hit bases. which means basically your goal here is to place a ton of TIE fighters and then immediately trade in with a bunch of 1-1s. Or you just let them sit, and them being readied is completely useless. This is obviously some form of TIE Swarm, but a TIE Swarm deck is going to want to be way, way, way lower to the ground than the type of deck that could really make use of this. And if you're the type of deck that's going to be playing 7-cost command cards, there's so many better options. I'm not really, outside of like possibly a world where a Dooku deck somehow uses this as an exploit engine, I'm not seeing it. I'm really not seeing it. I'm also not really seeing Shadowcaster. I'm looking at this tier list. Maybe I'm a bit of a hater, but Shadowcaster has kind of similar issues in that it's a 6-cost card that's designed to go in a deck that's going to probably run pretty low to the ground. I do think that the new Thrawn is going to be pretty decent, and of course that's going to be running a lot of win-defeated synergies, but the thing about a lot of the win-defeated synergies in this game is that they're early game incremental value. You know, instead of healing 2, you'd heal 4. Is that really a big deal? I don't really think so. A lot of them are just these little incremental. Doubling up on them is not going to help you that much. A lot of them are going to be out on the board well before you can play a 6-cost. I just don't think it really fits. I don't think there are a lot of massive, hugely important win-defeated effects that are going to really be worth it. I'm just not seeing it. We're adding another card into C tier. I really am more of a hater than I realized. I didn't really expect to be putting so many cards in C, but I think Stolen AT Hauler, this is going to be a card that sees some fringe play. I think there are going to be extremely aggressive decks that just cannot say no to a 3-cost 4/5 because their goal is to get out there, kill you in a couple turns. If any of their stuff dies, they're in big trouble anyway. But the thing here is that any deck that is not trying to immediately get out and kill you fast is going to be in a rough position when they realize that a 4/5 in space is just as good when their opponent gets it. So this, of course, is another card. A 3-cost 4/5 in space. When defeated, choose an opponent. They get to play this for free out of the discard pile. Again, I'm not a fan of playing cards for my opponent. I don't know about you. You might feel differently, but I'm just not a fan. I don't think it's going to be particularly good. The best case scenario, you kill someone very quickly, but the worst case scenario, you just lose. I might be biased. This is the only card that I think is in this entire list where I would strongly consider playing this out of aspect. I would consider playing this in a variety of decks that want to ramp quite a bit, especially Piet that could cheat this out to make up for the increased aspect cost, or the aspect penalty. It's a 6/9 with ambush. Once it's out, all of the costs that you pay while this is out are halved. This allows you to do some really crazy things with cards like Endless Legions. This allows you to, if you can cheat this out, ramp more than anything else in the game will allow you to ramp. I mean, you can just run away with the game if this lives even just for 2 turns. I think this is a fantastic card. I think this is going to be quite good in heroic green decks, but I will be trying to run it in a deck like Piet as well. I think it's just that good. I don't think this is quite that good, but this is my personal favorite card of the set. I think Turbo Laser Salvo is everything Nebula Ignition could have been. Turbo Laser Salvo, you choose an arena, a friendly space unit deals damage equal to its power to each enemy unit in that arena. So the thing about Nebula Ignition is that it requires a lot of upgrades to be out on the board, and it requires your opponent to not have a lot of particularly good upgraded units. So if your opponent is running things like pilots, you're shooting yourself in the foot, And if you don't have a perfectly upgraded setup, you're shooting yourself in the foot. The thing about Turbo Laser Salvo is that you put this in a big ship deck, again, like Piet or Emperor Palpatine, or I think there's a double green Hondo thing going around, and any sort of ramp command deck. And all you have to do is have one of your big space units out. And for a deck built around getting out big space units, that's not a big ask. If you have one 8/8 Star Destroyer on the board, this reads deal 8 damage to all of your opponent's stuff in one arena. So if you can ramp into a big Star Destroyer, play it super early, or even just on curve, and then completely wipe your opponent's ground arena because you haven't really been focusing on the ground arena and they've built it up a bit, that could be game over. Even in a scenario where you've got a couple of big ships down and your opponent has a couple of big ships down, this is a one-sided, basically win the game card. Now, of course, the point against it, and the thing that I think prevents this from being S tier, is you have to have a ship out. So this doesn't work as an emergency button in the way that Super Laser Blast does. A Super Laser Blast, if you are just absolutely getting destroyed, you can wipe the board and start over. But in even games, in relatively even games, or games where you're ahead, this is going to shut down your opponent's comeback really efficiently. This isn't. I don't think this is good, and I think the big difference here is unity of purpose. For each friendly unit with a different name than other friendly units, you get +1/+1. That's pretty good. But the break point here is, so if I have one unit out, I'm not playing this, obviously. If I have 2 units out, I'm still not playing it. If I have 3 units out, I start to think about it. And if I have 40 units out, this is actually pretty good. I feel like 4 is the break point where you're like, oh, this is a pretty strong play. But the problem is, double green is not necessarily the type of deck that's going to benefit from stat increases like this. I could be wrong, but when I think about double green, I'm thinking about ramping into stuff that is already much bigger than my opponent's units. So getting a little bit of a boost, or even a sizable boost to a unit's size, or all of your unit's size, isn't necessarily as good as taking all of those hard-earned resources and just playing another big unit with a better effect. I think this is really held back by the fact that double green decks don't necessarily want to go wide, and cards that want to, or decks that want to go wide, are not going to want to pay the aspect penalty. You're never going to play this for 8, and as a result, I just don't really think this has a home. You could make the argument that this could go C tier, but I think at the end of the day, I think this is a big ask, and I think there are going to be cards with better payoffs. So that's everything. The 2 best cards in the set, in my opinion, legendary-wise, are going to be the Starhawk and yet another Han Solo. I think a couple of these capital ships are going to be quite good. I'm looking through trying to decide if I want to make any last-minute changes. I might. You could make the argument, if we're rating this on how often things are going to see play, Darth Vader is not necessarily going to be super impressive, but it's going to be useful in a wider range of decks, so it could see play more often. But I'm pretty comfortable leaving this B tier. I don't think it's a bad card, but I think this is just another solid card that isn't necessarily going to change the game in the way that some of these cards in A tier will. And of course, just to repeat, just because something is in C tier doesn't mean it's not going to see any play. I just expect these to be standout cards in subpar packages. As for the most part, just there's not enough support. In a year's time, it might be fun to look back at one of these cards suddenly becoming great because of a card in 2 sets that nobody could have seen coming. But as things currently stand, I think I'm pretty comfortable with this list. And hopefully I'm also pretty comfortable with the way this video came out. This is kind of fun to make. A lot of my Star Wars Unlimited videos don't necessarily do as well as my other videos, but this is what I do in my free time a decent amount. I'm more engaged with Star Wars Unlimited than I am some of the other topics I cover on this channel recently. So it's just a fun video to make. If this video does well, or if I have some free time, I might also do the set for leaders at some point. But for now, thanks for watching. This has been one of my longer videos, so I appreciate it.